Right, guys, you are either going to get hard or soft engineering this summer, guaranteed. So you please learn this, revise this, memorize this. Let's go into soft engineering in rivers. Guys, the first method is so easy. I can't give you anything easier than planting trees. Let's go into what's so good about planting trees and how it actually helps the river from kind of like over flooding. So to gain marks on this, you got to really talk about planting trees. What's good about it? They're obviously way more cheaper, so you can talk about that. They can increase, let's say, biodiversity and habitats. There's so much you could talk about in so many ways. So let's look into some points. Don't read the whole thing. You can pause it as well. Planting trees will obviously increase the interception and absorption of rainwater. So you could talk about that. You could talk about how they're generally low cost and they've got many environmental benefits, such as creating new wildlife habitats. However, they obviously take a lot of space on the land. So let's move on now to the next method. Right, floodplain zoning. Many of you have understood this a bit better, but it's, in other words, it's just a policy that kind of controls what can be built near the river. For example, it's a policy that only allows certain things to be built near the river and it's relatively low value. So for example, playing fields and pasture for grazing can be built here because they are lower value, and if the river does flood and they go underwater, it isn't as bad financially. For example, higher value things will be further away from the river. So I've essentially explained it, but can you put that into your own words if it comes up in the exam? So here's the summary. So zoning means to restrict something. So thinking about floodplain zoning, it's literally restricting the different land uses to certain locations. For example, the area closest to the river will have animal grazing. Okay, let's move on. This is effective as it prevents what? Property and business from being damaged. So you've got to link it back. Okay, but however, you could say zoning restricts urban development. For example, you can't really, if there's zoning in place, you can't really build property that could increase housing shortages. This has come up in your exam before. So can you see, if you look at the key, pasture for grazing closer, but settlements further away. As long as you explain that, you're good. This is river restoration. I'm going to quickly go through this. It's a bit harder to kind of grasp, but it's basically you remove the hard engineering or the straightening. You allow the river to kind of naturally go back to its natural state, which is plants and vegetation to grow, and that will naturally also reduce the risk of floods because of the roots absorbing, let's say, a lot of the floodwater. The last step that people always forget is that you could argue that another soft engineering method is flood warnings, and especially like text telling you that a flood is coming. So thinking about flood warnings, if you get a text like that saying there's a severe flood warning in your area, which you could talk about, saying many people could get flood warnings and alerts such as severe flood warnings, flood alerts, or or flood warnings. This will allow people to kind of act and prepare, so people can install, remember these floodgates that we've seen on a trip. You could talk about that. The flood warnings will help people obviously install floodgates, which will then prevent water entering into homes. And you could also talk about how many people could actually move items upstairs, protecting homes from damage, financial loss and damage. The advantage of this method is that actually gives enough people time to move things because they get the alerts really early, and that will help reduce the cost. They saves them money, and it also is a very cheap option compared to, let's say, other things like planting trees. But obviously don't forget what we've looked at today. So flood warnings, we looked at planting trees, and floodplain zoning. These are the four that you could get asked about.